we don't believe that there are emotions that are good or bad. The idea is that we steward them, we understand them. Many times our emotions are trying to tell us something about our reality, our experiences, and they're actually a lens through which we can see life. The value of emotions is when we do steward them well, they create a place, a conduit of connection with other people. I often say that I cannot feel somebody else's grief, but if I can feel my grief, then I can be with them in their grief. So the goal of this is not to get rid of our anxiety. In fact, if we don't have anxiety, we're going to be missing out on some cues that could actually be putting us in danger and be threatening. It's just to be able to interpret and understand our anxiety. And when our anxiety is disproportionate to a situation or a circumstance, that's when it begins to create chaos.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and as usual, we have our host, Dr. Greg Miller, with us today. How are you, Greg?
I'm great. Made it here with no problem.
Well, we're happy to see you arrive, and just in the nick of time, arriving is today's guest, Dr. Russ Smidt. And I say doctor because in his former life, for 30 years, he was a pediatrician, and he's now retired from that, and we are happy to have him as a member on our staff here at Faithful and True, in which he is a life coach and does a fabulous job in working with the men and men's group here at Faithful and True. Welcome.
Good to be here, Randy. Thank you.
Okay.
And one of the things I would say is there are many times we're here at Faithful and True, we have a team made up of people with a variety of different backgrounds and perspectives and educations and credentials. And so it's great to have a former doctor on our staff, a medical doctor, because today what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be doing two podcasts, one on anxiety and one on ADHD, and kind of like in our brief conversation that we just had, recognizing some of the interaction between the two of them. But I want to start with what is the significance of why we are talking about, in this case, anxiety here at Faithful and True, and what is the interaction between addiction and anxiety, and how does it show up in our clients?
Well, that's a complicated question. We're going to try and get to as much and many parts of it as we can. I think big picture-wise, I'd just like to start with the premise. We are a faith-based organization, and we believe that the emotions are God-given, that we're created in this way. And so we don't believe in good emotion or bad emotions. There are emotions that are more or less pleasant, but we believe they're all from God, and they all serve a purpose. We believe that emotions can help guide us and to know what we need. And so starting from that premise, I would say the reason that we talk about it is because of the fact that the addiction can cause a lot of emotion, and that emotional background can result in different ways of presentation in the addiction. So,
so it's this idea that I have emotional reaction to the addiction, but my emotions can also be driving me into the addiction and to the acting out. And I really want to affirm what you said. It's this idea that we don't believe that there are emotions that are good or bad. The idea is that we steward them, we understand them. Many times our emotions are trying to tell us something about our reality, our experiences, and they're actually a lens through which we can see life. And another just general principle is the value of emotions is when we do steward them well, they create a place, a conduit of connection with other people. I often say that I cannot feel somebody else's grief, but if I can feel my grief, then I can be with them in their grief. So the goal of this is not to get rid of our anxiety. In fact, if we don't have anxiety, we're going to be missing out on some cues that could actually be putting us in danger and be threatening. It's just to be able to interpret and understand our anxiety. And when our anxiety is disproportionate to a situation or a circumstance, that's when it begins to create chaos.
Yeah, I think if we kind of pull back and look at this from a big picture, there's anxiety as an emotion, And that goes all the way up to anxiety as a disorder or a clinical anxiety or medical anxiety. And it's important to make that distinction. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So everybody has anxiety. We're all born with anxiety. I was reading Psalm 107 today, and it repeats about being in distress and how you seek God in your distress. That's translated as anxiety. So it's been around a long time. When we're talking about clinical anxiety, we're talking about an anxiety that's debilitating. And so to have an anxiety disorder is different than being anxious. Now, when it comes to addiction, you throw in this stress element that can look like anxiety. So somebody that's in the throes of their addiction, they're in this craving place, they're drug seeking if they're a drug addict, sex seeking if you're a sex addict, your sympathetic nervous system is all revved up, your blood pressure's up, you're just on edge all the time. That can feel like anxiety, and we can call it anxiety if we want. And that's not a normal anxiety. That type of stress is not something that God created. It's something that happens from using a drug, in this case illicit sex, that causes a change in the way our brain processes information and creates this thing that looks like anxiety, which can be unpleasant to live with.
So
obviously.
is it a deal where I'm an addict and I have anxiety because I'm afraid that I'm going to get caught, or I'm afraid that there's going to be consequences, and so I have anxiety about the fact that if I'm exposed, there is going to be consequences. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about, is that different? It's this another association of this anxiety that begins to formulate around the energy of the addiction itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that, because if you do look up, I did a little concordance work today, and the word that's used in Psalm 107 can be interpreted as anxiety, or I believe sorrow is the other one. So, these words have multiple meanings. Our sensations have multiple sources, and it's not clear cut. And if there's anything I want to say today, it's that these are not simple things. Mm-hmm. And that's why, we don't get too caught up in labels here. For the most part, A, because we're not diagnosticians in this setting, and B, because we're mainly treating you as a person. We're not treating you as a label. Mm-hmm. And that was true in my pediatric practice. And so, why do we even bother with labels? Why does it matter if we say that you have an anxiety disorder or not? The main reason is that if you have a clinical condition, it can be treated. Mm. Now, if you look at something like OCD, which used to be categorized with the anxiety disorders, and at the last DSM-5 change in 2013, I think, they switched it into its kind of own category. But that's compulsions and obsessions, compulsions being acts, obsessions being thoughts, and the idea being that you have these thoughts that you can't get out of your head. Now, we all obsess about things from time to time. I don't know about you, but when I was going to propose to Susie, I was pretty preoccupied and obsessed with how it was going to go and what she was going to say. I was pretty sure it was yes, but there's always that thought.
What'd she say?
Yeah, well, she said yes, as it turns out. So is that an obsessive disorder? Of course not. That's a situational thing. If you're, having trouble with compulsive behaviors, well, maybe you've been robbed. And now you have this compulsive behavior. You double and triple check your door locks. Mm. That's not a disorder. That's just a way of creating safety for yourself. And so when we're talking about disorders, we're talking about things that are so extensive and so unusual that they stand out and get in the way of you being able to live your life. And that it's important to find a professional to do that. You hear people all the time throwing around words. Well, you have an anxiety disorder, you have ADD, you're an OCD, Well, you might have qualities where you're a little more than the average person, but that doesn't put you into that other category. And the reason it makes a difference is if you're in the category that's in a clinical place, you actually can get some help with that.
Right. Well, I want to go back to a word that you used earlier that I think is significant, and that is debilitating. Mm-hmm. If your anxiety or the obsessive compulsive experience is so significantly impacting your life and the way that you live and function, then it's debilitating. It's shaping and forming you in a way that's limiting. But to have a circumstantial or a temporary focus on something, or a anxiety because the test results are coming out and I'm not sure how I did, or I'm expecting a phone call from my doctor and I keep kind of focusing and obsessing on the phone to see if maybe they've called, that would be temporary. It's associated with a particular experience. So would you say that for the people listening, one of the things to pay attention to is this present with me no matter what my circumstances are? Or is there an ebb and flow based upon my circumstances? And we were also talking about just this idea of understanding it on a continuum, where, like you said, everybody has anxiety, everybody has these thoughts. And so from 1 to 5, 1 is occasionally I have them, 5 is I constantly have them. Even in the assessment of how present is this on a regular basis, and how much do I experience this no matter what my circumstances are, can also be kind of a criterion that you might use to consider, is this a disorder that needs to be addressed?
Yeah. On the continuum thing, just as a fact or a medical thing, is that the first time anything is described, it's always the most severe form of it. So the first time somebody was diagnosed with asthma as a condition, it was somebody that could barely breathe. It was a potentially deathly thing, right? The first time ADD was diagnosed, it was in people that were in jail because they were impulsively stealing things. They were in the poorhouse because they couldn't keep a job. They kept wandering off the job, following butterflies. And then over time, as you get more and more comfortable with what it looks like, you start seeing milder and milder forms of it. So you can have asthma that is debilitating, and the mildest form of asthma, as far as I know, is cough variant exercise-induced asthma, where your only symptom is coughing when you exercise, not very debilitating at all, and that for most people. The same thing is true with anxiety. The first, major anxiety disorder were people that were in panic attack mode all the time. They couldn't function, or they were agoraphobic. They couldn't leave the house. Now you diagnose people with lighter and lighter forms of anxiety, lighter and lighter forms of depression. Major depression were people that, couldn't leave the house. They couldn't work. They couldn't move. They were just really significantly affected. So I think the continuum aspect is historical as well. And that's true with all medical things, including psychiatric things. The reason that's important is that you have people all the time that says, I have a little ADD or I have a little anxiety. If it's not significant, then it's really not a clinical thing, right? I personally don't think there's a thing like a little ADD. You either have ADD or you don't. And we can make it more complicated too. But
I either have ADHD or I don't, and yet I have it, but the way it manifests itself may be lighter or less than somebody else.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there are all kinds of complicating factors. If we were able to give you a number of inattention, so ADD is the inability to sustain attention on something difficult, which is misperceived. When the Harry Potter books came out, all the parents were coming in saying, my kid can't have ADD. They're reading right through the Harry Potter series. Well, that reading is easy. If you don't have a learning disability, that's not difficulty sustaining attention on something difficult. That's hyper-focus on something you enjoy, which is part of ADD. So, this continuum it's important to recognize that there are other factors. Intelligence is a factor, how stable your social situation is. If you have, we gave you an ADD score of 70 out of 100, and we put you in a stable married family with good income, good schools, good social support, you have normal intelligence or above average intelligence, you're going to do much better than if I go into your town of Chicago and go down to some poor area where there's gunfire every night and there's a single, maybe you're cared for by a grandmother and, you have all these things working against you. You could have exactly the same intelligence, but all those other things are working against you. Plus that same 70 is going to cause you a lot more trouble in school. So there's lots of other factors. Now let's make it a little more complicated just for fun.
Okay. I love complications.
All right.
Oh, I'm getting
So
anxious.
when you look at mental health things, there are a lot of situations where you have more than one thing. It's called co-occurring disorder. So the other thing is that one thing can look like another. So if you look at anxiety just as a symptom, not as a condition, but just a symptom, anxiety is a common thing, or maybe inattention. Let's go with inattention. Inattention is a common symptom of anxiety. Check, I'm anxious, I'm having trouble concentrating. It's one of ADD, it's one of depression. I'm so low and depressed, my brain's slow, I'm having trouble concentrating. OCD, I'm obsessed with a thought, I'm having trouble concentrating. So that single inattention can be, the cause could be any number of things. Mm-hmm. It can also be cause and effect. Let's say I have ADD and learning disability as two things that are going together, which is not uncommon, and I'm having trouble in school. Now, every time I go to school, I'm going to be tremendously anxious because I know I'm going to do poorly. On the other hand, I could have tremendous anxiety. I go to school, I'm having trouble paying attention. People label me with ADD, right? So it could be cause and effect. Or, here's the best part, you could have both. Right? You could have both. So even if we treated you great with ADD treatment, you might still have anxiety left over because you also carry a clinical diagnosis of a general anxiety disorder or social anxiety disorder. So it gets very tricky and very complicated, and it's just super important that when you do think about these things in the context of addiction, because addiction also has a high level of co-occurrence with all these mental health things. So if you're getting an evaluation for addiction, it's always important to also get an evaluation for these other potential co-occurring things. I usually tell men that you don't get any extra credit by getting sober without treating your ADD.
Right.
You get no extra credit for that. So you might as well make it as easy as possible on yourself. If you're super depressed, you can't get out of bed, how are you going to be motivated enough to do your recovery work?
Right.
You don't get any extra credit for pushing through that. You might as well get help with your depression so that you have the best possible chance of getting through your addiction.
Well, it's what we talk about. If you're going to try to recover, you've got to get your brain to cooperate. Mm-hmm. And if there are certain things in your life that are limitations or keeping you from functioning well, it's important that you're getting the support you need for that. Mm-hmm. So we started talking about anxiety. What are some of the indicators that someone might have clinical anxiety, not just at times I feel nervous or anxious?
Well, it's interesting. I use myself as an example. So when I started recovery, the first counselor I went to suggested that I had anxiety, and I told her, that's crazy. You're crazy, not me. I'm the calmest guy I know. Everybody tells me I'm the calmest guy I know. And she goes, no, you have anxiety. And so she says, you have to go to an anxiety group. So that was my first group. It wasn't a recovery group. It was anxiety group. And I was deathly afraid to go. And I went. And as it turns out, I have horrible anxiety. And
she knew what she was talking
about.
She did.
She was a professional. And it turns out, my family is anxious like crazy. And so that's one of the reasons why I didn't pick up on it, is because I grew up in a tremendously anxious environment, which I thought was normal. Mm-hmm. And so as I kind of managed my anxiety, I thought, well, this is how everybody lives. Everybody doesn't live on the edge of panic. I thought, wow, that's great. This is a great way to live. Mm-hmm. So it can be something you don't even notice. Somebody else might have to notice.
What was it about the group that allowed you to begin to see your own anxiety? Was it a group where there was education about anxiety and you kind of go, oh, that's me? Was it observing the other people that were there and recognizing that, oh, I share some of the same attributes that I'm seeing in the group? Mm-hmm. Kind of what awakened you to the reality that there was anxiety?
Well, first of all, I did a lot of reading about it because that's, what I knew how to do. I think the group, it was a therapist-led group, which was helpful. And as we know, it's a lot easier to recognize some of these things in other people mm-hmm. than it is in us. And so I would see,
kind of like you went, wow, you are really.
Well, it really helped when they would describe their, what they would do, and then say they weren't anxious, and you're going, oh, yes, you are, and then you had to look at yourself a little more clearly. But yeah, I think that was it. And then talking to the other people, it was nice to be with other people that had the same experience, and it allowed me to be more open-minded. And then, of course, I got evaluated by a psychiatrist, and that was helpful as well.
I think when I'm telling my story, I often talk about the fact that I am a very anxious person. I don't know if I'm clinically anxious. I am very anxious. And I wasn't aware of it until I began recovery. I often say I never thought about having a panic attack until I began recovery, because I understand now that so much of my coping strategies and my addictions were an attempt to manage or contain that anxiety.
Sure.
And I really didn't have access to it until I began to live more sober and be free. Then I could begin to see it, and I had access to it. For you, in your own circumstance, was there a stigma to being anxious? Was like, I know that we can grow up in a Christian home where we're supposed to be at peace, we're supposed to be calm, we're supposed to be anxious for nothing. And so there can be a kind of a Christian stigma that if you have anxiety, you must not have faith. Was that a message that you got, or was that not?
Yeah, I think the strongest messages are the unspoken ones. And so we never talked about emotion at all. So that left me as a child who became a Christian at age 5, the same year I saw my first pornography, to read the Bible on my own and see all these emotion words in the Bible and to interpret them initially as a child would. So I see, be anxious for nothing, right? And so as my childhood, Sunday school every week, Sunday night service, Wednesday prayer meeting, I heard that verse and I interpreted it as, well, clearly maybe I'm not a Christian. I'm not praying enough. There's something wrong with me. I shouldn't be anxious. And eventually, I think I just learned to suppress the anxiety altogether and say, oh, okay, I think I'm, because I'm not panicky, I'm okay. And I would get panicky. There's all kinds of examples of me as a kid being super uptight or stressed or on edge. I didn't recognize that as anxiety. Right. I just thought that was normal.
It's interesting. I was thinking in my own family system, we have code words for anxiety. And we don't necessarily use the word anxious, but we have stressed or uptight. In my family growing up, it was worried. My grandmother was kind of known for being the worrier. And we had these systems in place that we used to let her know that we were safe. This was way before cell phones. But we didn't talk about anxiety. We just talked about my grandmother's worry and how we tried to accommodate that. And then my mom worried also. And so I think that sometimes instead of just naming it for what it is, we didn't have the word anxious or anxiety. And so we did talk about it in these coded ways with each other. It wasn't until years later that I began to go, oh, no, that thing that we talked about we called worry was actually my grandmother's anxiety.
Yeah, I think what happens as you're describing is as you become aware of if you have an anxiety problem, you don't necessarily notice the impact until after you find out that that's an issue. So for instance, one of the things I did to control my anxiety was not to study until the night before a test, ever, or to do a term paper until the night before, which I did several times. I had several times where I was handing my paper in to the professor, trying to jam it through the window of his car one time. One time his door was locked and I could hear him in there, so I slid it under the door because I was working right up to the last minute. But that was a way I controlled my anxiety, because in my head, if I didn't do well on the test or on the paper, I could blame it on the fact that I waited until the last minute.
I remember when I was introduced to this idea of the relationship of procrastination and perfectionism. And a lot of people who have those perfectionistic tendencies are actually procrastinators for that very reason, where if I am rushed, if I'm hurried, and then I don't get that good grade or I don't finish the project, then I can blame it on the fact of, well, if I just had more time, it could have been great. And it becomes not just an excuse, but it becomes an opportunity to maintain our perfectionism and still believe that perfectionism is possible versus really challenging that as a concept, and it keeps us stuck in that loop.
Yeah. I think there's all kinds of examples of I think one of the things that's been good about recovery is to watch my children grow up in a different environment than I did. And one of the best examples I can think of is we had this tradition in my house of my dad putting scripture under the plates. So when we'd have Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner, everybody looked under their plate and read the verse. Now, I didn't really enjoy that when I was a kid because we'd often have other company there, and then you had to read it correctly, and then one year my son was, I don't know, he was probably 10 or 11, and we were going around the table, and he just said, "I pass," and literally it struck me like a thunderbolt. That's an option.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I had a choice. It just never even occurred to me that was a choice. And so I had all this anxiety over the years, and I just would push it down and just go through with it.
What if what's true is actually growing up you didn't have a choice? That I pass wasn't seen as acceptable, but the way that you and Susie had created an environment, you had created the opportunity for I pass. So it was there for your children, even though it wasn't there for you. You showed up differently for them. And I think that is part of what we're trying to do, is no matter what it was that we experienced, we're trying to live differently for our children so that they maybe have some of the options that we didn't feel like we had growing up.
Yeah, and I don't want to, we never throw parents under the bus here. My parents never said you have to read it, ever. That was all the story in my head was I don't have a choice. And quite frankly, part of that was the addiction talking, where you get into this place of addiction where you feel like you're a victim and you don't have any choices, and I don't think you see clearly. And so they was never actively discouraged. Nobody said, hey, you have to read it.
Right.
It was just the expectation, and it wasn't their fault. It was actually my inability to have a model for somebody that would be able to have the freedom to do that.
What are some of the physical symptoms of someone that might have an anxiety disorder? How does it show up in the body?
Well, that's a good question. I think it can show up in different ways, but the classic way would be like the fight, flight, or freeze type of thing. So it's where you feel like your blood pressure's up and your heart rate's up, and so when you're really anxious, that's what it looks like. Now that's probably, if you have a scale of 0 to 10, that's close to the top of anxiety. And one of the things that's true of a lot of our people when they come in is they're crappy. Can I say crappy? They're crappy at identifying their emotions. And when you have trouble identifying emotion, you only can identify the most high-end part of it. Right. So when I first learned I had anxiety, I started to recognize it when I was super anxious. And as I got better at it, I recognized mild and milder forms of it. So, what does it look like? Sometimes it's helpful to talk to your friends and say, what does it look like when I'm in what you would perceive as a stressful situation? One of the first things I noticed was my palms got sweaty and cold. And that had always been true. And I sang in front of the church. I did all kinds of public things, and I always had a wet, clammy hand, and I thought that was normal. And as it turns out, that was a huge sign of anxiety, and I started noticing that in more and more situations. Fidgeting, is a good way to do it.
I was thinking of that, and for many of us, we are constantly telling our children to sit still or calm down, versus recognizing that they're being fidgety is trying to tell us something about what it is that they are feeling.
Yeah, it could be they're bored, or it could be they're anxious, or it could be any number of things. I think, people, sometimes they withdraw when they're anxious. You avoid eye contact. I know that in junior high, my oldest son, when he was advising my youngest son going into middle school, he said, just keep your head down and you'll be fine. When you're in the halls, don't make eye contact, don't wear anything that's going to stand out. He goes, that's how I survived middle school is keep low on the radar. That's how he managed his anxiety. Not everybody would do that. Some people manage their anxiety by being super out front.
Right, by being big and calling attention to themselves.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to continue this conversation in the next podcast. So we're going to keep talking, and we're also going to focus a little bit more on ADHD and how that shows up and what the relationship of that is to our addictions.
Okay, that sounds great.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us today. This has been a great conversation about anxiety, and we appreciate Russ's time today. If you have heard this message today and it's opening your eyes to some of the help that you'd like to reach out, Faithful and True is here for you. Visit our website at faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll see lots of resources available to you, as well as information about our 3-day intensive men's journey workshop. Coincidentally, we have the July version starting here tomorrow, where we'll have roughly 30 gentlemen from across the country here at our center. And if that's the kind of help that we'd like to offer to you, please look into that on our website. Until then, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thanks for listening. And we hope that this coming week is a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.